Right. Well, I can't see you, but I can speak to you, and I feel like I'm calling from not only from exile from Galut, but also from the wrong generation. But let me start. So thank you for the chance to participate in the important meeting, and to all the faculty organizers and the food servers and the staff and the janitors and all the others who worked so hard to make this extraordinary conference happen. It's a testament to Rabbi Sachs and an honor to contribute as a way of thanking him for his decades of work, his deep and seminal shaping of the modern Orthodox Jewish world in which I live, for his innovations and contributions to all the areas that are represented by the panels today and tomorrow. It's really splendid to consider all that he accomplished. He was a master, of course, in philosophy, Jewish ethics, biblical exegesis, modern Jewish thought, and on and on. And of course, his extraordinary work as a public intellectual. Finally, we could add the rabbinic leadership of the British polity, and of course, the astonishing personal capacity of Rabbi Sachs to touch the lives of so many individual Jews in a truly remarkable number of congregations and communities. One can walk now into any modern Orthodox shul in the world and read the English language Siddur along with his brilliant translations and thoughtful commentary. He is the modern Jewish thinker that my Christian and Buddhist and Muslim and Hindu scholarly colleagues at Chicago know well too. And to all of that, I'm going to add a personal note of gratitude, as so many have done. Rabbi Sachs met my son, Rabbi Natan Zoloth Levi, when he was a campus rabbi at the University of Bristol, and invited him to London to work with him as his representative on social justice and the environment, which you can see is essentially the family business. He delighted in Natan's most challenging and riskiest ideas. He encouraged his interfaith work and supported him to complete his doctorate. Not only was Rabbi Sachs a remarkable and compassionate mentor and teacher to him, in the middle of all of his public global leadership, he never once forgot my name or my scholarly work or my pride in my son's work whenever we crossed paths. The breadth of scale, from the global to the smallest personal attentions, is simply breathtaking. And for the teacher of Hesed, he was the practitioner of Hesed. To have been greeted by that lovely smile was a great gift, and his memory already is a blessing and a joy. So part one. Here's the itinerary for this paper. I want to turn to Rabbi Sachs's work on Jewish ethics and consider what he means by this concept of responsibility. And I want to think along with you about a puzzle that we know is urgent, our failure to solve the crisis of climate change. The miracle of teaching, as Sachs would remind us, is this working through a contemporary problem together, using the languages of scripture as well as philosophy to argue. I'll bring in some other Jewish friends of mine, Hannah Arendt and Emmanuel Levinas, to be in our argument. Now, let me make the claim that of all the ethical questions, especially the embodied ethical questions of bioethics, there is only one at the center of the story. How can we justify our lives as morally good? This becomes urgent when we turn to the question of climate change, perhaps the single most critical temporal demand. This feels like a test or a trial, and I'll return to this, how we need to explain ourselves and our choices and to whom. By which we mean, in Jewish thought, what are our obligations to the world? This is a whole quarter worth of seminars, but I only have 20 minutes. We live in a world of others on which we depend and contend and need, to whom we testify, yet we understand ourselves as individuals whose freedoms define our identities. We negotiate our lives in view of others, balancing their needs and desires with our own, and lately we've been very intent on securing our rights, just at the moment when it seems like the needs of others, all the others, are more overwhelming than ever. There's tent cities and the homeless in the parks, bombs in the parks in Ukraine. Of course, all the demands of COVID raised the stakes of this moral ordering, as each of us had to consider how much we could rely on one another for protection and care, placing the moral appeal for individual liberty against the moral appeal for collective response. And over all of this, in the driving rain, the terrible winds, the storm that has come to us, the crisis of a changed climate, which even if its etiology is driven by greedy and wasteful producers and profiteers, it is in every absolute way also our collective responsibility to face. Much of civic life in democratic societies is based on this capacity to place the needs of the collective prior to the needs of the individual and to take responsibility, as Sachs argues. And can there be a more urgent question, or one about which we disagree so deeply? So let's start by turning back on my claims and asking a little more of them. First, are there grounding assumptions for Sachs's claim that individuals have some relationship to a commons? and that, moreover, perform some sort of balancing act whose successful resolution results in a good society? Perhaps there might be. First, we all must live in a society of some kind, and for that to function, there must be a condition of peace. And second, we all wish to be good, or believe ourselves to be good, leaving aside for a bit the postmodern worry that we cannot define the good or will never agree on what it means to be good. And third, that our choices, rational norms and desires, the logics themselves, are bounded by the facts of the world as both beautiful, miraculous, joyful, and as befallen and stricken with grief. Finally, Sachs would argue that the world is divinely given to us as fractured and broken, and in need of tikkun olam, a concept that he derives from Kabbalistic sources and from the first chapters of Genesis, in which human failure results in what he calls chaos. It is a condition of radical uncertainty. God creates order, he says, man creates chaos. After Adam, Eve, and Cain transgress boundaries of Horot, he writes, the punishment or consequence of sin is exile, being in the wrong place, not at home in the world. Justice in the Hebrew Bible is thus more than a matter of law. It restores a broken order, repair of the damage they have done. But exile ends in homecoming. Judaism has a fundamental vision of order disrupted and then repaired. The Bible, Sachs reminds us, is God's call to responsibility. But the call to whom? Now, Sachs argues it's all of us, a self that's both Jew and non-Jew. It's not the standard self of classic ontology, that self, founded by Plato, reified by Kant, that autonomy, who believes themselves their sole author, this bundle of rights. Perhaps you might think that that is the sort of self we need to face climate change, one that is good with science and numbers, with accounting, the power of acquisition and order, adding up and possessing things, making tools, the hand on the hammer, maybe the wall. For Sachs, the self is formed at the moment of choice in uncertainty, and the Jew then turns from nihilism and fatedness to hope. But now let me bring in Emmanuel Levinas and Hannah Arendt. Like Sachs, they claim that what is needed is a responsible self, one who is responsible, but for all the others. For Levinas, the ethical must be primary, antecedent to philosophy's being. For Levinas, the self is not constituted at all, actually, and in fact just awaits the call of the other, which is prior to being in the way that duty is prior to rights, and the other's demands prior to freedom. What is the self? The self is the one who can come up with what is needed, even the bread from one's mouth. The incessant call from the other, who is both the stranger and your teacher, who questions you and breaks into the cheerful acquisition of your stuff. The stranger, widow, and orphan who we learn to ignore. Perhaps the first turning away, the first destabilization of the responsibility for climate change was when we learned to turn our faces from the homeless people in our cities, when men and women can literally lie down on the sidewalks over the heat grates to keep warm, and we would not drop everything we carried to turn to them and bring them to the kitchen to eat. If ourselves are made by the encounter, says Levinas, the sort of selves made by this non-encounter, the flight from the encounter, this is also who we are. Sachs sees the face of the other as the face of love, however, Hesed, which for him is prior even to justice. When Sachs asks us to act to restore justice, he means that to be a moral self, one cannot be limited by assembling rational will and rights held like conquest and possessions in the hand, nor by the sense that one is in it alone. Sachs argues that it is monotheism that shapes a social self. The brokenness of the world creates a situation of radical uncertainty, and the response to that is choice between nihilism and hope. A shift in responsibility occurs in Torah, he argues, as divine history moves from God's action to human agency, from Genesis to Exodus. A free, moral self is increasingly created by both biblical narratives and by responsive action, which is what transforms the Jewish people, in his view, from an Am to an Edah, capable of living in the land. This selfhood is both a temporal journey and a turn to a non-instrumental love. And for Sachs, it is marked by the Sabbath, a space that anticipates the messianic, a neutral, truthful, diverse space where people mingle around in peace, in education, in self-restraint, where one is a servant of God, tending but not changing the world. God, he says, is a bridge that spans the metaphysical abyss between self and other, me and you. Our parenthood of God turns humanity into a single extended family with all the mutual obligations that entails. This moral being alters the world. Indeed, as Arendt reminds us, the smallest act in the most limited circumstances bears the seed of boundlessness, because one deed and sometimes one word suffices to change every constellation. This is sobering, of course, But then ethics is supposed to be a serious business. The stakes are so very high, it should sober us up. But back to my questions of self and freedom in society in all its complexity, and in climate change and a call to respond. For Sachs, only the actions of the individual can restore the common good and the safety of the natural world. Now, Levinas is wary about ideas like the common good and wants us to remember that one knows the idea of justice only because one sees it in the eyes of a specific other, all the eyes of the others. One sees the specific, other receiving God's law and grace at Sinai, this outward-facing, not internal law, and one knows one is not alone. The name for society is language for him, discourse, perhaps translation, surely argument. But Arendt does not turn to Sinai, but to Athens, where she thinks about society. Her society is politics, a place to argue for one's ideas. Arendt turns to the philosophic triptych set in place by Aristotle. There's a sphere of family, the onklos, the state, the ecclesia, and between the family and the state, the agora, the place of negotiation, the public square, universities. The space for Arendt is the space of appearing, and it is democracy itself. Fragile, easily destroyed, but it is where power really resides, which can be overrun, of course, by violence. Whenever people gather together, she says, it is potentially there, but only potentially, not necessarily, and never forever. For Arendt, social chaos ensues when we collapse the agora, eliminating it in favor of the ecclesia or retreating into the onklos. The agora needs to be where authenticity is primary, and it is not safe from sharp disagreements, ask Socrates, for example, or attend the University of Chicago. But it has to be a place where honesty, parrhesia, remains the central civic virtue. The danger is that one might confuse the internal space of the home as the total range of human action, or conversely think that only the state is the arena of human action, which would be for Arendt the temptation to totalitarianism. Sachs, in his last book, shares Arendt's concern for the lost common space of civil society and the social violence of our fractured time, and sees the restoration of the commons as the place for morality that is not beset by the competitive, merciless spirit of the state or the market. Social freedom, he says, cannot be sustained by market economics and liberal democratic politics alone. It needs a third element, morality, a concern for the welfare of others, an active commitment to justice and a compassion, a willingness to ask, just not what is good for me, but what is good for all of us together. But by this morality, this ethics of responsibility, he turns to the role of personal restraint, one of the strongest capacities of religious traditions, of course, to protect the collective good. And the virtue that is needed is the capacity to stop the Sabbath, for Shemitah, for Jubilee, and for fruit trees, and for endless consumption, and for power, arguing we have no right to freedom as if exercising the right harms the freedom of others. A society in which everyone feels free to do what they want is not a free society. It is not a society at all. It is anarchy. I have not forgotten about our puzzle about climate change. For Arendt, ethics is wordliness. It is a virtue applied. And for Levinas, ethics is the first philosophy, the event of the other who breaks into totality and ruptures our complacency. But for Sachs, the virtue is kindness, chesed, a loving kindness only possible when the ethics of restraint allows a limit on human mastery. We must live in society. We all wish to be good or thought to be good. We all know the world is fractured and in need of repair. Part 2. But as Sachs argues, if ethics is so easy, how does it turn out to be so hard? How does one extend this ethics of responsibility into the duty to repair the crisis of climate change? Sachs's response is based on this idea of the Baut Shishit, the prohibition against wanton destruction, a commandment that he derives from Deuteronomy 20, where one is enjoined against cutting down fruit trees when one is enacting a war. He extends this to a broad set of personal norms. This personal ethics of responsibility is doubled in texts, he says, about other wasteful behaviors, in allowing the mother bird to be freed while eating the eggs, and in replicated in the practices of cessation and restraint. Sachs would have us turn to Torah to understand the way that human responsibility restores order. But let me extend his thought, both textually and politically, and to let me turn to the great grim text of rabbinic responsibility, a responsibility for everything, even for others who live beyond our sight. And this is one chapter later in Deuteronomy. This is when responsibility becomes central to redemption itself in the same discussion about war in Deuteronomy 21. Deuteronomy 21 goes, if in the land that the Lord your God is assigning to you to possess, someone slain is found lying in the open, the identity of the slayer not being known, your elders and your magistrates shall go out and measure the distance from the corpse to the nearby towns. The elders of the town nearest to the corpse shall then take a heifer which has never been worked, which has never pulled a yoke, and the elders of that town shall bring the heifer down to an ever-flowing wadi which is not tilled or sown, and they shall break the heifer's neck. The priest shall make the declaration, our hands did not shed this blood, nor did our eyes see it done. Absolve, O Lord, your people Israel, whom you redeemed, and do not let the guilt for the blood of the innocent remain among your people Israel, and they'll be absolved of blood guilt. What's going on here? Somebody's dead. Someone has killed him and fled, for the word is found slain. There must have been a lot of blood and a sense of violence. Someone has raised the alarm. It is, after all, in the textual middle of a discussion about war and that complete collapse of all human order and chaos, and we've just been told not to cut those fruit trees. The place is desolate, a liminal space far from habitation and the usual course of human affairs. Who's this guy? What's he doing out here? The elders and the judges shall go out to see. We're to imagine the old men, the ones in nice suits from the wrong generation. They go themselves, not the cops or the servants, but the most important fellows in the society, well-dressed burghers of the cities, pulling the mooing baby calves behind all the way out to the desolate, muddy place between their cities. For it is a matter of great importance, and they've come prepared to judge. It is a matter of justice in courts. There are places in the word of the Mishnah that comments on this text, that discusses all of this where the rule of law does not hold, like at the lawless border and the Gentile cities, because violence and social chaos is imagined to be common there. But here, the body lies in the field near an ordered path between two Jewish places, where justice should be the norm, where good elders and nice people live. But something has gone terribly wrong. The Mishnah then turns to the ghastly business of the coroner. It's a violent time, not unlike our own. The violence is so profound, the parts of the body are scattered, the head severed at the neck, and the person scattered, so much meat and limbs. And Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer have an odd and seemingly petty discussion about whether to bring the head to the body or the body to the head. What possible difference can it make now? For Rabbi Akiva, the head is the part of the body that matters. There was a person, not an anonymous course, since the head is to be buried where it lies, this is the last honor, the last shred of dignity to move the body back to the head. Of course, enter Emmanuel Levinas, for whom the face, as the mark of the vulnerable other, which was the synecdoche for the call to the other in whom one was fully realized. Akiva and Eliezer repeat their positions on that later matter of measuring. Measuring the exact difference from the body to the city is critical. It is the last little bit of law left after the lawless act. Measuring, making a clean human line in the abandoned lawless place. But measured from where? And Akiva measures from the very center of the face. One must get very close to measure in such a way. One must look directly at this particular face. The corpse's killer is unknown, but Akiva, the perfect Akiva, the person still is a particular person, as much as one can be, alone and nameless, with a nameless killer on a field, on a road between two cities. The Mishnah tells us a young calf is brought out and innocent, and then is suddenly from behind struck at the neck with an axe and killed. In the rabbinic imaginary, it works as a sympathetic ritual magic. An innocent person has been killed, maybe struck from behind unawares, and so we'll reenact this with an innocent baby animal sneaking up on it from behind, the men in the suits and the judges who would wield a hatchet. The Egel Rufa will atone for the nameless stranger. The ground is hard, and we were meant to be standing in a wadi. Now we're at the center of the rabbinic anxiety, and the text is structured as if we're watching the biblically prescribed ritual from off stage. But why a voice is recorded as saying, as an aside to us, the reader in this ritual, why is this ritual happening at all? Because it looks like the elders are expiating guilt. They're doing a ritual done by guilty people, but clearly they weren't the killers of the corpse of the field in the road. But they are. In the rabbinic imagination, they are in fact understood as murderers, for they have let a man leave their city and their order and walk alone to his death, perhaps a hungry, thirsty, desperate man, perhaps fleeing from climate change, so desperate as to be cast out without caution, to walk alone after nightfall, to have no place to go, and so took to the road a homeless man. He was unseen, like the hundreds who have fled the storms to our cities, to my city. The priests now implore God for absolution, and they do so in the name of the entire people. So while no one is guilty of the killing, all are responsible for the abandonment. Notice how huge is this responsibility. It takes in everyone, all your people, Israel. Not only the elders or the judges or the priests, not only the people of the city who have seen the man by the road out alone and have turned away and do not see him. Everyone who is alive has been part of a society that allows the homeless one to be on the road at night, the hunger and the thirsty one to be alone, vulnerable, death coming up unseen from behind him, and we are all a part of it. The Mishnah wants the reader to know that it is not the magic ritual nor even the incantation in Hebrew, but the acceptance of responsibility that is valorized, after which God approves. The other is our responsibility, reminds Levinas. The face calls us to this. The face speaks. The first word of the face is, "Thou shalt not kill." It is an order. There is a commandment in the appearance of the face, as if a master spoke to me. However, at the same time, the face of the other is destitute. It is the poor for whom I can do all and for whom I owe all. But one has to see the other. That's the trick. And I want us to return to the problem of unseen faces and the question of guilt, especially for all the people of Israel, the people who the priests are considering, and for that which God absolves us. To be a Westerner is to live in a world that is careless of the stranger and of the land, that kills as it goes in the ordinary way, in every ordinary day. To be a participant and implicant in global warming. To understand this is to take seriously the implications of being a Jew, living a Jewish life in this treacherous time. And perhaps it's to ask a question about Jewish ethics, which is, in what way do these commitments of Jewish ethics matter to the rest of the polity? And this is the question to which Rabbi Sacks has called us. His book on ethics asks us who we are and the sort of moral situation in which we find ourselves in. What have we done and what are we doing here? Selves that have been shaped not only by luck, but by text and tradition and the gaze of the others, answered and unanswered and turned towards and turned away from. This is more to say on this idea of responsibility and love and justice and their intertwining in the ethics of Rabbi Sacks. He turns to pragmatic encounters to teach us that faith is riskiness, where the stakes are yet higher, where more than ritual is asked and more than and now we are talking about not only about memory in the past, but about hope in the future. Hope is the possibility of transformation for Sacks. As Arendt says, we to participate in the story that began before us and will continue after us. And if our traditions agree on anything, they converge on a single lesson. We must attend to suffering, to care about the suffering of others, even the ones we can never see, and most carefully to the suffering of the vulnerable and to the stranger, the ones that Arendt called surplus people, made homeless by the ongoing catastrophe of climate change. As we stand here now between our cities, the slow violence of climate change will strike down the unaccompanied ones and will be our choices, our actions that drive the knife. Even if we cannot see this, we are responsible. It is an odd problem, this zero-sum game of justice within scarcity, within abundance, but as Sacks tells it, we are all connected by what he calls a gossamer strand of kindness that links self to self in bonds of love. Before justice, he tells us, there must be love. And that is his ethics of responsibility. In all his work, you'll see how injustice is undone, overthrown, as it were, by a different sort of calculation. A theopolitical economy where the poor are integral to the grace and goodness that we seek. We cannot do it without them, for they are created by being the person that can answer their command. It's a lot of work. In the case of a pandemic, for instance, or climate change, these large meta problems, it means that you need to bear the responsibility of the threat to the other, even if it is not affecting your own life. It is not in the sense of the market, meant by the market or by the state, even fair. It requires supererogatory choices. Levinas tells us that he wants ethics to be prophetic, and Sacks believes that we can transform suffering. Yes, he and the prophet Isaiah. Take the wretched poor into your homes, build up the causeway, then the waters of righteousness will roll. This is when it is morning, says Isaiah. But says Levinas, the more I answer, the more I am responsible. The debt which increases into infinity and infination of the infinity becomes glory. To heal a fractured world in the terms of the Torah is to be faithful, and really being faithful in these texts is to decenter the self so completely that the last is first, the smelly, failed stranger is your brother, and the wayfarer is do something of yours. How much further from the business of business have we got? How much further from a state which is, after all, structured for war? We can move paradoxically through sacrifice and scarcity to the economy of abundance, transcendence, grace, moral law, which is only found in the common world. The house that we build together, he says, the healed world imagined so vividly over and over and over again by Rabbi Sachs. That it is still possible for me to say this is in large part due to the hope, his hope that it just will be true if we say it enough. Unless we believe it, all that would be left to us are policies that meet us where we are. And where we are is so tired and so bored, apparently, that it's very hard to always remember that you are responsible for absolutely everything. Levinas reminds us that it is given to me to answer before the one to whom I am responsible. The thou is positioned in front of a we. The presence of the face, the infinity of the other, the presence of the third party that is the whole of humanity.
Laurie?
See you. Yes. Yes. Almost done. Almost done. One more paragraph. And Sachs reminds us that it's not just the whole of humanity. We must, as it were, serve it is the entire fragile created world, every single creature. I promised you a puzzle, and I did not promise you a solution, only some interesting ways to think about our failure to yet fully confront the crisis that we all face with him. We want to be good. We really do. To every storm of the 9 that swept my home state of California last week, too many people died, and this will not be the last storm nor the last catastrophe. We've altered the very air. Did they die because of greed or because of confusion or mendacity? Levinas might ask if they died because we couldn't speak to each other enough to create a world. Arentz would say because we could not mobilize a movement. Sachs would say because we did not connect the holy and the good. All we have in the Agora is language, to talk in the space of appearance. In the ecclesia of the state, we have armies and police power, and the eklos, the family, you have love. But in the fragile middle public square, all I can give you is signs and words and books as he has given us, and that might convince you. For Levinas, for Arendt, a good argument is everything we need to make the moral world possible. Rabbi Lord Professor Sachs adds for us another word to make the word faithful, prophetic hope, for which we cannot, without which we cannot proceed. Thank you.